Chapter 5. The Next Meeting. Toad met the counsellor the following week and sat in his usual seat. He was surprised how quickly he was getting used to the routine, and he now thought of the chair as his chair. Sometimes he wondered if anyone else ever sat in it, or if the room was only used once a week for him. But the thing that impressed him most about these counselling sessions was receiving the heron's full and undivided attention. Toad began to realise that he had never before received anyone's full attention in his entire life. Whether he had ever given it to anyone was a question yet to be asked. The heron listened to him attentively all the time. It was as if, for an hour, he centred himself entirely on Toad and focused on his situation to the exclusion of all else. Consequently, he found that he did not have to keep saying, "Do you see what I mean?" or "Have I made myself clear?" which he habitually found himself using to excuse his waffle and imprecision. Providing that he, Toad, found the words to describe what he was thinking, the heron listened and understood, but when he failed to understand, he would say so, and then Toad would be forced to be more precise and search for other words and expressions which would convey his meaning more exactly. Somehow the way in which the heron listened to him and prodded him with questions enabled him to bring all sorts of thoughts and feelings to consciousness. Gradually he was beginning to explore and examine aspects of himself of which previously he had been unaware. In other words, Toad had started to learn. "Well, Toad," said the heron, "how are you feeling?" This question no longer surprised him, and in fact he was expecting it. "I'm feeling different," he answered. "I'm still low in my spirits, but I keep finding myself thinking about our previous meeting when you talked about the child ego state. Are we going to talk about it any more this time?" "Yes," said the heron. "I would like to explore that with you, but it means that I must change roles." "What do you mean?" asked Toad. "It means," replied the heron, "that I shall behave differently. If I am to teach you about the child state, I must take on the role of the teacher. One of the differences will be that I shall be in a telling mode rather than a listening mode. If I successfully teach you about the child ego state, then you will be able to use those ideas to explore your own self and your own experience. Remember, there is nothing so practical as a good theory." As Toad was trying to puzzle out just what that meant, the heron stood up and went to the flip chart. "The child ego state," he began, "is made up of the archaic relics of our childhood. It consists of all the emotions we experienced when we were little. You must remember that at birth we start out with only the very basic emotions. In our early years, these gradually develop into more subtle and complex patterns of behaviour which become central to our very self and form part of us, defining our behaviour for the rest of our lives. The result is that now, in particular situations and circumstances which are different for each of us, we respond automatically from that basic position. Once again, we act and feel like the child we once were." "Could you explain that a little bit more, please?" asked Toad. "Certainly," replied the heron. "I am suggesting that we are born with certain basic emotions, rather like the primary colours, which are similar for all babies. But as we develop as individuals, our feelings and responses become increasingly individualistic, just as basic colours mix together to create all sorts of subtle shades and hues. Does that make sense?" "Yes," said the Toad. "I can understand that." "Right then," answered the heron. "What do you think these basic emotions are?" Toad frowned and scratched his head, but was unable to come up with an answer. "Look at it this way," said the heron. "I know you are not married, but do you have any nephews or nieces?" "Yes, of course," said the Toad. "I always remember their birthdays, and I love taking them their presents at Christmas. In fact, I think they're rather fond of me." "Good," replied the heron. "So how would you define some of their basic emotions?" "Well, they are usually rushing about all over the place having fun. I don't know where they get all that energy. And then when I arrive all laden with presents, they throw themselves at me and give me the most tremendous kisses and hugs. Very cheering, really. Mind you," continued Toad, "it's not just the presents. I get the same kind of welcome whenever I go. They're just very affectionate." "I'm sure they are," said Heron. "Let's write this up." So he went to the flip chart and wrote the heading Children's Basic Emotions, and underneath Fun and Affection. "Any others?" the heron asked. "They can certainly get angry with each other," said Toad. "I have known them to have the most terrible fights when I have had to separate them physically. They can be little devils." "So there's another basic emotion," said Heron. and wrote anger on the chart. "Oh, yes," said the toad. "I certainly agree with that." "Can you think of any others?" asked Heron. "I'm a bit stuck," Toad replied after a pause. "Try thinking of it in another way," said the Heron. "What are the basic emotions we seem to be born with, which just come naturally, without having to be learned?" "I'm not sure if this is what you're after," said Toad, "but my little nephews and nieces can easily get upset and sad. I remember on my last visit they were crying because their puppy had just died. I tried to comfort them and they were all in tears, but I wasn't much help. Ended up crying myself. I'm really very soft-hearted, you know." Here Toad blew his nose and fiddled with his bow tie, and his eyes were bright with tears. "That seems like a very basic emotion," said the Heron, and wrote sadness on the list. "Any others?" Toad shook his head. "I can't think of one." "How about fear?" asked the Heron. "In my experience, children can easily become scared, and it's very easy to frighten a child. Unbelievably, some adults seem to enjoy doing just that, but that's another story. Anyhow, do you agree with fear?" "Most certainly," Toad replied. "I can still remember waking up screaming from my first nightmare when I was very small, and no one taught me to behave like that. I just yelled. It came naturally." "Right," said the Heron. "So I think that completes our list." And he added fear to it. So this was what was finally written on the flip chart. Children's basic emotions: fun and affection, anger, sadness, fear. All of these emotions added together make up what is called the natural child, and this forms a significant part of the total child ego state, said the counsellor. "So," said Toad, "when I see someone being affectionate or getting angry or sad or frightened, I can say they are in their natural child. Is that right?" "Exactly," said the Heron, "although anger is more complex, and we shall learn more about that particular emotion later on." "And people can be in their child state no matter how old they are?" asked Toad. "Most certainly," replied the Heron. "People get into their child state and feel and act exactly the same as they did when they were little, quite irrespective of their chronological age." There was a long silence as Toad fell into deep thought. Finally he spoke. "I think," he said, "that I am often in the child ego state," and lapsed back into silence. "But," said the Heron, "that's only half the picture." "What do you mean?" said Toad. "Is there more to be said about the child ego state?" "There certainly is," replied Heron. "A great deal more. As we have seen, a child's natural behaviour is a mixture of these basic emotions," and he pointed to the list on the flip chart. "For instance, a baby will scream for food and attention, drink as much milk as it can get, and then sleep when it is replete and content. All those natural feelings come into operation from day one, and as the baby grows physically stronger, so its emotional life develops and becomes more powerful. But there are other factors which come into play, and the most important of these is the baby's parents. They impinge on its consciousness right from the beginning. Almost everything the baby does causes some response from its mother or father, and these have a profound influence on the child. Usually a mother responds to her baby's cries with love and comforting behaviour, but parents can act in an unloving way. The mother may be tired or even ill and respond harshly, or the father may have strict views on how children should be reared and may deliberately ignore the baby's cries for fear of spoiling it. "It makes you realize just how vulnerable babies are," Toad said thoughtfully. "I never realized before just what power people have over their children. They have total dominion. They can love them or reject them, cuddle them or abuse them. It's just a lottery what sort of parents you get." He sat very quietly, thinking deeply about his own childhood, trying to remember what it felt like. After a while the Heron spoke again. "You're quite right, Toad," he said. "Most parents try to do their best, and very few want anything but good for their children. But parents are only human, and they inevitably pass on their beliefs and behaviours to their offspring, as surely as they pass on their genes. And children just have to learn to cope and defend themselves from the consequences." "But how can they learn to cope?" asked Toad, now quite animated and obviously thinking hard. "Babies and little children can't think logically. They can't sit down and plan how to cope with their mother's or father's behaviour." He said this quite strongly, as if he was dealing not with an abstruse point of child psychology, but with something deeply personal, as indeed he was. Well, of course, a baby or infant can't think through these issues logically or consciously, said Heron, but what they do is learn through experience. This kind of learning involves not just our brains, but our total self. What we learn is a strategy for living. We develop behaviours which enable us to cope with our parents and others, and if we are lucky, we have enough energy left over to enjoy life. This means that every baby must learn how to adapt his or her basic behaviour to cope with their primal situation. These adaptations become the nucleus around which the rest of our behaviour grows and develops. Of course, we are influenced by many other events later in our lives, but these earliest experiences shape the beginning of us, and we can never deny or forget them. "Could you slow down a bit?" pleaded Toad. "Just when I think I've grasped something, you go on to something else." "I'm sorry," smiled the Heron. "I know that I tend to go on a bit about this, but I believe it to be of the greatest importance. In all our work together, Toad, understanding your childhood is the key to understanding yourself. As Freud said, where there is id, there shall ego be. But I'll explain that later. Now, Toad, what is it in particular that you did not understand?" "You said that as we learn to cope with our lives as infants, we have to make adaptations to our natural behaviour. What does that mean?" "That's an excellent question," answered Heron. "Let me answer by telling you a short story. It's science fiction, so you can let your imagination run free. Imagine a small planet on which there are only 3 living beings, yourself and 2 others. These 2 other beings are more than twice your height, and you are completely dependent on them for everything. This includes not only your food, but also your emotional needs. Usually they treat you well, and then you respond by loving them. But sometimes they get angry with you, and this makes you feel frightened and unhappy. And because they are so big and powerful, you feel helpless. What do you think about that?" "I don't much like that story," answered Toad. "If that was me, I would build a spaceship and escape from those 2 creatures as fast as I could." "Unfortunately, you can't escape, so you are just going to have to put up with the situation and learn how to cope as best you can." "In other words," said Toad, who had caught on to the real meaning of the story, "I shall have to learn to adapt my behaviour to this particular situation." "Well done," replied Heron. "You really are learning now, for as you have realised, my story is a parable of infancy. We start our lives with only 2 or sometimes only 1 other person in our life. They are so much bigger than us, and we are totally dependent on them. As there is no escape, our only option is to adapt to their every whim. Let me draw a simple diagram to illustrate this." He went to the flip chart and drew a circle and wrote above it, "The child ego state." Then he divided the circle in half with a horizontal line. In the top half he wrote, "Natural child." In the bottom half he wrote, "Adapted child." "Now, Toad," said Heron, "we must finish here. It's been a very full session, and I am sure it has given you a lot to think about. So let me give you some homework for our next meeting." "Oh, no," said Toad, looking quite anxious. "Not homework. I always hated doing prep. I don't think I shall be able to do any this week. In fact, I've just remembered I have a lot of work to do. I will probably have to go up to town. And lots of other things," he added lamely. There was a long silence. "Just as a matter of interest," said Heron, "how would you analyse what you have just said to me?" "Well," said Toad, "I simply told you why I'm unable to do any homework." He looked uneasy and found it difficult to meet Heron's eye. "Yes, but how do you think it sounded to me?" Toad shifted in his chair. "I don't know, really. I merely gave you the reasons why I can't do it." "Were they reasons?" asked Heron. There was a long pause. Then Toad spoke. "Perhaps you thought they sounded like excuses?" "What do you think?" asked Heron. "I can understand you thinking that," answered Toad, "but the word homework gives me very bad feelings. I can remember exactly how I felt at school in the evenings trying to learn Latin verbs or memorize poetry, and then the fear of punishment the next morning if you got it wrong." "So what state were you in when I suggested homework to you just now?" asked Heron. "Child," replied Toad instantly. "All of those old fears and anxieties came sweeping over me. Is there something wrong with me, Heron, that I should behave like that?" "No, of course not," said Heron warmly. "We all have words or situations which trigger off our childhood feelings. I suppose the most commonly shared word that can do this is dentist. "Oh, no, not the dentist," said Toad, clutching his jaw in mock agony. "So I will avoid the dreaded homework word," said Heron, "and instead ask you simply to do some work before our next meeting." "What kind of work?" asked Toad, still a little on the defensive. "Just think about your own childhood. Think about those early days and your earliest memories, and then we can see if our work here throws any light on them. Goodbye, Toad. I look forward to seeing you next week."